My work rival turned down a transfer to a branch that would have doubled her salary, and when I asked her why, in front of the entire office, she looked me dead in the eye and said, "This office has one reason I'm staying," and then she didn't look away. That was the moment 3 years of arguing over conference rooms and stolen parking spots turned into something I did not have a plan for. My name is Marcus Whitfield. I'm 35, I run operations for a regional logistics firm outside Denver, and until about 4 months ago, my entire professional identity was built around being better at my job than one specific woman named Elena Cruz. I want to be clear that this wasn't a small, friendly competition. This was a full-blown, multi-year Cold War fought over spreadsheets, quarterly numbers, and who got credit in meetings neither of us particularly wanted to be in. If you'd asked me a year ago to describe Elena Cruz in one word, I would have said insufferable, and I would have said it with the kind of conviction usually reserved for describing weather disasters. If you ask me the same question now, the word that comes to mind is very different, and it took an entire company-wide meeting, a canceled transfer, and one sentence said in front of 30 coworkers to get me there. Let me back up, because none of this makes sense without the history. Elena and I started at Kestrel Logistics within 2 weeks of each other, 6 years ago. I came in from a competitor with a chip on my shoulder about being underpaid there. She came in from business school with a chip on her shoulder about being underestimated everywhere. We were both hired into the same tier, same starting salary, same vague job description that basically amounted to figure out how to make the supply chain less chaotic and don't break anything expensive while you're doing it. Management, in what I now recognize as either genius or complete negligence, decided to give us overlapping territories. Same clients sometimes, same budget pools, same promotion track, with exactly one spot opening up every 18 months or so. You can guess how that went. The first real skirmish happened 4 months in, over a client account neither of us had officially been assigned, but both of us had quietly started courting because our manager at the time was famously disorganized and never actually finalized who owned what. I'd spent 3 weeks building a relationship with a mid-sized furniture distributor out of Colorado Springs, learning their shipping patterns, taking their operations director out for coffee twice, doing the slow, patient groundwork that eventually turns a lead into a client. Then Elena walked into a meeting I wasn't even invited to and closed the deal in an afternoon, using half the research I'd already compiled and shared in a company folder because I, foolishly, believed in transparency at the time. When I confronted her about it, she didn't apologize. She said, and I remember this word for word because I've replayed it in my head roughly 4,000 times since, I didn't take anything that wasn't available to whoever moved faster. That was Elena in a single sentence. Competent, unapologetic, and completely unwilling to soften a true thing just because it was inconvenient for the person hearing it. I hated her immediately and completely. For the next several years, our rivalry became something close to institutional. Coworkers learned not to schedule us in the same meeting without a clear agenda, because we'd derail into competing arguments about methodology that had nothing to do with the actual topic. We fought over the good conference room, the one with windows and a working coffee machine, so consistently that our office manager eventually put up a shared calendar just to manage the two of us like unruly toddlers. We fought over parking spots close to the entrance during winter, which sounds petty until you've walked across an icy Denver parking lot in January and understood exactly how much a 30-foot advantage matters. We were, by every reasonable definition, insufferable to be around, and everyone in that office knew it. What nobody knew, including me for a very long time, was that somewhere underneath all of that friction was something else entirely, something I'd spent years mislabeling because the alternative felt too complicated to sit with. Here's a detail I didn't fully understand the significance of until much later. I never actually wanted Elena gone. I wanted to beat her. Those are not the same thing, though for years I genuinely believed they were. When she took a week off for a family emergency 2 years ago, the office felt strangely flat the entire time, and I told myself it was because I had nobody worth competing against, Nobody sharp enough to keep me honest. When she got a promotion offer from a competing firm 18 months ago, and I found out through office gossip before she'd even told me herself, my stomach dropped in a way that had nothing to do with professional rivalry and everything to do with a feeling I wasn't ready to name. She turned that offer down, for reasons she never fully explained, and I remember being relieved in a way that embarrassed me privately for weeks afterward. I filed all of that under competitive instinct for a very long time, because it was easier than the alternative. Then, 4 months ago, Kestrel Logistics announced they were opening a new regional branch in Salt Lake City, and they needed someone senior to lead the transition team out there for at least a year, possibly longer, with a significant salary bump and a guaranteed director title waiting on the other side of it. It was, by every objective measure, the kind of opportunity you don't turn down if you're serious about your career. Everyone in the office assumed it would go to either me or Elena, since we'd spent 6 years building parallel reputations as the two most driven people in the building. Leadership offered it to Elena first. I found out because our regional VP, a genial and terminally indiscreet man named Doug Halloran, mentioned it to me over lunch like it was already settled news. "She's going to be great out there," he said, buttering a roll like he hadn't just detonated something in my chest. "Bigger market, bigger budget, real chance to build something from scratch instead of fighting you for scraps every quarter." He laughed at his own joke. I did not laugh. I told myself, again, that my reaction was professional jealousy, that I was disappointed because it should have been me, because 6 years of competing for scraps, as Doug so elegantly put it, deserved to culminate in something bigger than watching my rival get handed the exact opportunity I'd been working toward. I spent that entire afternoon in a genuinely foul mood, snapping at a vendor on the phone for something that wasn't remotely their fault, staring at my monitor without actually reading anything on it. What I didn't examine, not once, not for even a second that day, was the much simpler and much more uncomfortable truth sitting directly underneath the jealousy. The idea of Elena Cruz not being in that building anymore made me feel something closer to grief than competition. I didn't figure that out on my own. I figured it out because of what happened 3 weeks later, in a Tuesday morning all-staff meeting that was supposed to be a routine quarterly update, and instead turned into the moment my entire understanding of the last 6 years quietly rearranged itself. The meeting was standard until the end. Doug ran through quarterly numbers, a few operational updates, the usual corporate choreography that makes everyone check their phones under the table. Then, almost as an afterthought, he mentioned the Salt Lake City branch, congratulated the transition team that had already started forming, and then, looking directly at Elena across the room, said, "And of course, we're all still hoping Elena reconsiders. The offer's still on the table if you change your mind before the fiscal year closes." The room went quiet in that specific way rooms go quiet when everyone realizes they're witnessing something they weren't supposed to be witnessing yet. I sat up straighter. "Wait," I said, before I'd fully thought through whether I had any right to say anything at all. "You turned it down?" Elena's eyes flicked to me from across the conference table. 30 people were in that room, and for one very long second, it felt like all 30 of them disappeared, and it was just the two of us, the way it had felt during 100 smaller arguments over the years, except this one didn't feel like an argument. "I did," she said. "Why?" I asked, and I want to be honest that I didn't ask it kindly or gently. I asked it the way I'd asked her 100 combative questions over the years, sharp, almost accusatory, because 6 years of habit doesn't dissolve just because the ground underneath it has quietly shifted. That's a director title, Elena. Bigger budget, bigger market, everything you've been working toward. Why would you turn that down? I expected a deflection. I expected one of her clipped, efficient non-answers, the kind she gave in negotiations when she didn't want to reveal her actual position. What I got instead was Elena Cruz looking directly at me, in front of 30 coworkers, in a Tuesday morning meeting that was supposed to be about quarterly logistics numbers, and saying, evenly, without a single trace of her usual defensive edge, "This office has one reason I'm staying." She didn't elaborate. She didn't look away. Doug, sensing the sudden shift in temperature of the room, cleared his throat and moved on to the next agenda item with the practiced ease of a man who'd spent decades pretending not to notice things in meetings. But I sat there for the rest of that meeting hearing nothing else that was said, running her sentence through my head on a loop, trying and failing to convince myself she meant something other than what every cell in my body was telling me she meant. After the meeting broke, I caught her in the hallway before she made it back to her desk. "Elena," I said, "can we talk?" She stopped, arms crossed, that familiar guarded expression sliding back into place now that we weren't in a room full of witnesses. "About what?" "About what you said in there." It was a meeting comment, Marcus, not a confession. It felt like more than a meeting comment. Something flickered across her face, gone almost as fast as it appeared. "You've spent 6 years being wrong about what I mean when I say things," she said. "Why start trusting your instincts now?" That should have ended the conversation. It had ended dozens of similar conversations before, both of us retreating to our respective corners of the office to nurse whatever version of pride had just gotten bruised. Instead, I found myself saying something I hadn't planned, hadn't rehearsed, hadn't even fully processed before it left my mouth. Because for the first time in 6 years, I don't want to be wrong about this one. Elena went still. The hallway was mostly empty, just the low hum of the printer down the corridor and the muffled sound of someone's phone call from behind a closed door. She looked at me for a long moment, long enough that I started to regret the honesty, started scrambling internally for a way to walk it back into something safer. "I have a meeting," she said finally, and turned and walked away before I could say anything else. I want to tell you, I handled the rest of that day with dignity. I did not. I sat at my desk rereading the same email 4 times without absorbing a single word of it, replaying her sentence. "This office has one reason I'm staying," from every possible angle, trying to figure out whether I'd just imagined an entire subtext that wasn't actually there. I didn't get clarity that day. I got it 3 days later, in a way I genuinely did not see coming. It was a Friday evening, most of the office already cleared out for the weekend, when I stayed late trying to finish a report that was due Monday and had somehow gotten away from me all week, mostly because I'd spent most of that week distracted by a hallway conversation I couldn't stop dissecting. I heard footsteps in the otherwise empty office and looked up to see Elena standing in my doorway, still in her work clothes, a folder in one hand like she'd come up with an excuse to be there before she'd fully decided to use it. "You're still here," I said. "So are you. I have a report due Monday that I have somehow made 0 progress on." "That tracks," she said, and there was something almost gentle in the way she said it, none of the usual edge. She stepped into my office, set the folder down on the corner of my desk without really looking at it, and then just stood there for a moment, like she was working up to something. "Elena, is everything okay?" "No," she said. "Not really. I've spent 3 days trying to figure out how to have a conversation I've been avoiding for approximately 4 years, and I keep talking myself out of it, and I'm tired of talking myself out of it." My pulse did something complicated. "What conversation?" She pulled the empty chair across from my desk, the one usually reserved for vendors and the occasional lost in turn, and sat down slowly, like she was buying herself a few extra seconds. "Do you remember the Colorado Springs furniture account?" she asked. 6 years ago. The one I closed out from under you." "Vividly," I said. "It's basically the founding document of our entire rivalry." "I didn't take that account because it was available," she said. "That's what I told you at the time. It's not the whole truth." She looked down at the folder on my desk, then back up at me. "I took it because you'd spent 3 weeks talking about that client with more energy and focus than I'd seen from anyone at this company, and some very stupid, very young part of me wanted to prove I could do what you were doing better and faster, because I was terrified of not being taken seriously in a room full of men who already assumed I'd gotten this job on some kind of quota. And somewhere in trying to prove that to everyone else, I think I also started trying to prove it specifically to you, because your opinion had started matching to me in a way none of my other coworkers' opinions did. I sat very still, afraid that moving even slightly would somehow interrupt whatever this was. That's not jealousy, she continued. That's not even really rivalry, if I'm honest with myself, which I'm apparently only capable of doing after office hours on a Friday when nobody else is around to witness it. I think I've spent 6 years picking fights with you because fighting with you felt safer than admitting I'd rather be on your side of every argument than against it. Elena, I said, my voice coming out rougher than I intended. I'm not finished, she said, and I closed my mouth. When Doug offered me Salt Lake City, my first thought wasn't about the salary or the title. It was that I'd be spending a year, maybe longer, in a different state, building something new, without the person who spent 6 years making this job feel like it actually mattered instead of just being a place I show up to. And I sat with that thought for exactly one night before I understood that no promotion was worth losing whatever this is, even if I still don't fully know what to call it. The office around us had gone completely quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you aware of your own heartbeat. So that's what you meant, I said slowly. In the meeting, this office has one reason I'm staying. Yes, she said. I meant you. I've been trying to figure out for 3 days whether saying that out loud in front of 30 people was the bravest thing I've ever done or the single worst professional decision of my career. I stood up from behind my desk and walked around to where she was sitting, and she watched me the entire way, that careful, guarded expression finally cracking into something more open than I'd seen from her in 6 years of knowing her. For what it's worth, I said, I've spent the last 3 days trying to figure out how to tell you that I've been in love with the way you argue with me for at least 2 of those 6 years, and I kept telling myself it was competitive respect because the alternative felt like it would blow up the only consistent relationship I've had at this job. Elena let out a breath that was somewhere between a laugh and something more fragile. Competitive respect, she repeated. Is that what we're calling it? I'm working on better terminology. You have time, she said. I'm apparently staying. I reached out and took her hand, the one still resting on the folder she'd brought in as an excuse, and she let me, fingers curling into mine like something that had been waiting a long time to finally be allowed to happen. Elena, I said, can I ask you something, and I need you to actually answer it instead of deflecting the way you usually do? Depends on the question. Was there ever a version of the last 6 years where we could have just admitted this instead of fighting over conference rooms? She considered that for a moment, genuinely considered it. In the careful, thorough way she considered everything. Probably, she said, but I don't think either of us was ready to be that honest that early. I think we needed 6 years of proving to each other, and honestly to ourselves, that we were each other's equals before either of us could risk this being about something other than competition. If I told you I liked you in year 1, some part of me is convinced you would have spent the next 5 years wondering if I'd only said it to get an advantage. I thought about that, and I realized, uncomfortably, that she was probably right. The version of me from 6 years ago, freshly transplanted from a job where I'd felt underappreciated, chip firmly installed on my shoulder, would have absolutely turned a confession like that into another battleground, another thing to be suspicious of, another data point in an ongoing argument about who was really winning. That's a very generous read of my younger self, I said. I wasn't being generous, she said. I was being accurate. I know you, Marcus. I've spent 6 years learning exactly how you operate, mostly because I couldn't stop paying attention to you even when I told myself I was only paying attention so I could beat you at something. I leaned down and kissed her then. In an empty office on a Friday evening, 6 years of arguments over parking spots in conference rooms and stolen accounts finally resolving into something that felt less like a truce and more like the thing the whole rivalry had actually been building toward the entire time, whether either of us wanted to admit it or not. When we pulled apart, Elena was smiling in a way I'd genuinely never seen on her before, unguarded, a little stunned, like she couldn't quite believe she'd let herself get here. Well, she said, that's going to complicate the shared parking calendar. I laughed, actually laughed, the tension of the last 3 days finally breaking. We'll figure it out. We're apparently very good at negotiating shared resources under adversarial conditions. That is the single least romantic sentence anyone has ever said to me after a first kiss. I contain multitudes, I said. Most of them involve spreadsheets. She laughed at that, and it was the kind of laugh I'd heard maybe twice in 6 years of knowing her, unguarded and full, the kind that made the whole office feel warmer even though it was empty and the lights were half dimmed for the evening cleaning crew. The following Monday, we did not announce anything to the office, mostly because neither of us wanted to hand our coworkers 6 years' worth of gossip fuel all at once, but also because we both understood, without saying it directly, that we wanted to figure out what we actually were before we started explaining it to anyone else. That turned out to be harder than either of us expected, mostly because 6 years of professional rivalry doesn't just evaporate the moment you admit you're in love with someone. We still disagreed about methodology in meetings. We still had genuinely different approaches to client management that occasionally required actual arbitration from Doug, who at one point, halfway through a particularly heated debate about vendor contracts, said, "You two are somehow both more intense and significantly more polite to each other than you used to be, and I genuinely don't know what to do with that information." We didn't tell him. Not yet. What changed wasn't the intensity of our disagreements. It was what happened after them. Where a disagreement 6 months earlier would have ended with both of us stalking back to our respective corners of the office to nurse a bruised ego, disagreements now ended with one of us showing up at the other's desk 20 minutes later, coffee in hand, some version of an apology, or at least an acknowledgement that being right about a vendor contract mattered less than not letting an argument fester into the evening. About 3 weeks into whatever we were becoming, Elena told me something I hadn't known, something that reframed the entire Salt Lake City situation in a way that made my chest tight all over again. We were at her apartment, a Sunday evening, some low-effort dinner between us that mostly consisted of ordered-in pasta and a bottle of wine neither of us had properly poured because we kept getting distracted by conversation. "I need to tell you something about the transfer offer," she said, "because I don't want there to be things between us that you find out secondhand the way you found out I'd been offered it in the first place." "Okay," I said, setting down my fork. "Doug didn't just offer it to me because I was qualified," she said. "He offered it to me, specifically, over you. Partly because there was a rumor going around senior leadership that our rivalry had gotten disruptive enough that separating us geographically might be, in his words, good for overall office morale. They were planning to send whichever one of us seemed more willing to a different branch, and I found out about that framing about a week before the official offer came through. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. So they were trying to break us up before we were even together. Essentially, she said. And for a while, I actually considered taking it, not because I wanted the promotion, but because some part of me thought maybe distance would force me to finally get over whatever this was instead of stewing in it for another 6 years. I thought maybe if I wasn't seeing you every day, arguing with you every day, I could file this away as an old habit instead of something I actually had to deal with. What changed your mind? She was quiet for a moment, turning her wine glass slowly on the table without drinking from it. I drove past the lake we used to go to for team-building retreats, she said, the one nobody ever wanted to go to because the Wi-Fi was terrible and Doug insisted on trust falls. And I remembered the first time we actually had a real conversation there, not an argument, an actual conversation, about why you left your old job, and I realized I'd been carrying that conversation around for years without admitting how much it had actually meant to me. And I thought, if I take this transfer, I am choosing a title over the possibility of ever having that conversation again. And for the first time since I've known you, the title lost. I reached across the table and took her hand. I'm glad it lost. Me too, she said. Though I do think about the salary sometimes. Just so you know, that part still stings a little. We can renegotiate your salary here, I said. I have significant leverage with the person who now handles internal promotion recommendations. Who's that? Me, apparently, as of last quarter. She laughed, and it was the kind of laugh that had become familiar to me in a way I hadn't expected, warm and a little startled every time, like she still wasn't quite used to letting herself be that unguarded around someone. 4 months after that first honest conversation in my office, we finally told the rest of the office. Mostly because we got tired of the elaborate choreography required to avoid being seen leaving the building at the same time, and partly because Doug cornered me directly one afternoon and said, with the weary patience of a man who'd been managing our rivalry for 6 years, "Marcus, I need you to just tell me. Are you and Elena together? And should I stop scheduling separate performance reviews for the two of you like you're going to murder each other in the same room?" I told him the truth. He looked, honestly, relieved. "Thank God," he said. "Do you know how many HR complaints I filed just from the two of you fighting over that conference room? I was one incident away from installing a second coffee machine just to end the war." The office reaction, when it eventually became common knowledge, was somewhere between unsurprised and openly delighted. Apparently half the building had a betting pool going about us that had been quietly running for over a year, which was news to both of us and mildly insulting given how long it had actually taken us to admit anything to each other. A coworker named Priya, who ran client relations 2 desks down from Elena, told us with great satisfaction that she'd won $40 off that pool and intended to spend all of it on the good coffee we'd both been fighting over for years. The Salt Lake City branch opened without either of us. Kestrel eventually promoted someone from the Phoenix office instead, someone neither of us had strong feelings about, which felt, in a strange way, like the correct ending to that particular chapter. Elena did eventually get her director title, just not the way anyone originally planned it. Kestrel restructured the following year and created a joint operations director role that essentially formalized what Elena and I had already been doing for years, running things in tandem instead of competition, and this time, we both got the title, split evenly. No war over who deserved it more. A year after that Friday evening in my office, Elena and I moved in together, into an apartment exactly equidistant from both our old places, which she insisted on measuring with an actual mapping app before agreeing to sign the lease, because apparently some habits of exhausting precision never fully go away, and honestly, I wouldn't want them to. 2 years after the meeting where she told 30 coworkers she was staying for one reason, I proposed to her at that same lake, the one with the terrible Wi-Fi and the mandatory trust falls, during a company retreat neither of us had wanted to attend and both of us ended up being grateful for. Doug, when he found out, told everyone within earshot that he was taking full credit for our relationship because of the retreat scheduling, which is, generously, about 40% accurate. We got married the following spring, a small ceremony. Doug gave an unexpectedly moving toast about watching 2 of the most stubborn people he'd ever managed slowly figure out they were on the same side the entire time. Priya wore the same dress she'd worn the day she collected her betting pool winnings, which she considered good luck. My old furniture distributor client, the one from Colorado Springs who started this entire rivalry 6 years earlier, sent a card, which is a detail I still find genuinely funny. And sometimes, at work now, in meetings that used to be minefields, Elena will catch my eye across the table during some minor disagreement about quarterly projections, and instead of the old sharp edge that used to precede a fight, there's just something warm and a little amused, an acknowledgement that we're still exactly as stubborn as we've always been, just finally aimed in the same direction. She still brings up that meeting sometimes, usually when she wants to tease me about how long it took me to catch up to what she'd apparently already figured out. "This office has one reason I'm staying," she'll say, quoting herself with the particular satisfaction of someone who knows she said something that actually mattered. "You do realize it took you 3 entire days to work up the nerve to respond to that?" I was processing, I always tell her. 6 years of assuming I hated you is a lot to unlearn in one afternoon. "You didn't hate me," she says every time. "You just hadn't figured out yet that the opposite of indifference isn't always obvious when you're standing too close to it." She's right, of course. She usually is, and for the first time in 6 years, I don't mind admitting that out loud. So tell me, honestly, If your biggest work rival turned down a huge promotion and told you, in front of the entire office, that you were the one reason they were staying, what would you have done? And have you ever spent years fighting with someone only to realize the fighting was never actually about winning? Tell me your story in the comments. If you like this one, leave a like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.